Most people don't think of clouds of asbestos when they picture a small mountain, no town in Montana, but that's exactly what happened in Libby. A place that looked quiet and peaceful on the outside, but underneath the surface was hiding one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. This wasn't just some factory spill or short-term issue. What happened in Libby stretched across decades, poisoned the air, the soil, and even the water, and changed thousands of lives forever. It all started back in the early 1900s, when settlers arrived in the area. The mountains surrounding Libby were rich with minerals, and the discovery of a shiny, flaky mineral called vermiculite in the year 1919 quickly turned Libby into a busy mining town. Vermiculite might not sound exciting, but it was a big deal. When heated, it expanded and became light and fluffy, making it perfect for everything from insulation to soil conditioners, even packaging material. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Libby's mine was producing around 80% of the world's vermiculite, but there was a hidden danger buried in that shiny mineral. Mixed in with the vermiculite was a naturally occurring and deadly form of asbestos known as tremolite actinolite. Now, asbestos isn't dangerous when it's untouched, but once it's disturbed, like it would be in a mine, the tiny fibers become airborne. If those fibers get into the lungs, they can cause serious illnesses like asbestosis, lung cancer, and a rare but aggressive cancer called mesothelioma. The thing is, these diseases don't show up right away. It can take decades for symptoms to appear, which made it even harder for people to understand what was happening to them. In the early years, people in Libby had no idea they were breathing in anything dangerous. They just knew there was always a lot of dust. The mine sat just outside town, and that dust would drift into the streets, homes, schools, and playgrounds. Workers came home from long shifts with their clothes and skin coated in gray powder, hugging their families and spreading asbestos fibers unknowingly. Children played on contaminated fields, and some families even used leftover vermiculite from the mine for landscaping or insulation. Nobody warned them. Nobody told them the truth. The company that first mined vermiculite in Libby was Zonolite. They had started operations in the 1920s and kept growing bigger. But by the year 1963, a larger company called W.R. Grace & Company had taken over, and that's when the real tragedy started to unfold. By then, workers were already getting sick. Internal reports from as early as the mid-1960s showed that the company was tracking employee health issues. One report even listed names of employees with abnormal chests, a quiet way of noting severe lung problems. Many of those workers would later die of lung disease. Despite all this, nothing was done. The mine kept operating. People in town kept living with the dust. And even when someone got suspicious and asked questions about the so-called dust disease, they were usually brushed off. Some were told the mine only had tremolite, not realizing that tremolite was one of the deadliest forms of asbestos. One miner even remembered feeling completely blindsided when he found that out, saying, "We're not geologists. Nobody up on that hill knew what tremolite meant." The truth stayed buried for decades, and while the mine finally shut down in the year 1990, the damage had already been done. By the late 1990s, an alarming number of people in Libby were getting sick, and local doctors started raising red flags. The town that once prided itself on hard work and natural beauty was now dealing with a full-blown health crisis, and that was just the beginning. As the years went by in Libby, Montana, life seemed to carry on like normal, but behind the quiet mountain town charm, a deadly threat was growing stronger every day. It wasn't just the miners who were breathing in dangerous asbestos dust. It was their families, neighbors, and anyone who lived nearby. As the mining trucks moved back and forth from the hills, a fine powdery dust blew through the streets, coated homes, and settled in yards. People walked through it, kids played in it, and no one realized just how toxic it really was. By the early 1960s, the mine in Libby was producing over 80% of the world's supply of vermiculite. The mineral was everywhere, used in homes, gardens, and buildings across the country. But this particular source of vermiculite had a hidden contaminant, tremolite actinolite, one of the most toxic forms of asbestos. Inhaling just a tiny amount of it could eventually cause serious illness, but that wasn't common knowledge at the time. Most residents thought the dust was just part of life in a mining town. Even worse, mine waste was often handed out to the public for free. It was used to line driveways, fill potholes, build playgrounds, and even as soil in community gardens. People thought it was a useful resource, never suspecting it was full of deadly asbestos fibers. Kids slid down piles of the dusty waste after school. Local businesses unknowingly tracked it inside on their shoes. Churches, schools, and backyards were built on top of contaminated land. As time passed, more and more people in Libby started to feel sick. The illnesses didn't hit right away. Sometimes it took decades for symptoms to show up. Many residents experienced shortness of breath, constant coughing, or unexplained fatigue. Some were diagnosed with rare diseases like mesothelioma or asbestosis, which are directly linked to asbestos exposure. And these weren't just old miners nearing retirement. Many were young, healthy people who had never stepped foot in the mine. Doctors in town began noticing patterns. Lung issues were popping up in people who had no other risk factors. Families were losing loved ones without understanding why. By the time most people got a diagnosis, there was little anyone could do to stop the damage. And still, no official warnings were issued to the public. For decades, there were no signs posted around town, no public announcements, no testing. People continued living, working, and raising families in an environment that was slowly poisoning them. And although there were hints that the company behind the mine, W.R. Grace & Company, was aware of the risks, they continued to keep quiet. Internal reports dating back to the mid-1960s mentioned abnormal chest x-rays in workers and rising concerns about lung disease, but nothing was shared with the public. It wasn't just about sickness. The emotional toll was massive. Families lost mothers, fathers, siblings, and children. Entire households were affected. People who had trusted their community's main employer now felt betrayed. They had been left in the dark for too long, and by the time help arrived, the damage had already spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Still, the full extent of the disaster hadn't come to light. At this point in the story, the town of Libby was dealing with growing health problems, a rising number of unexplained deaths, and no real answers from those in charge. But the worst part? Most of the country had never even heard of it. The story of Libby was about to change, just not in the way residents had hoped. In the late 1990s, the town of Libby was still suffering in silence. Decades had passed since the mine first opened, and by now, hundreds of people had either fallen ill or passed away. Yet outside of Montana, hardly anyone knew the town existed, let alone the slow-motion disaster happening there. That changed when a Seattle-based journalist named Andrew Schneider received a tip from a source about a small town dealing with a strange cluster of lung diseases. Schneider began digging. What he found shocked him. Medical records, internal company memos, and reports from former employees pointed to a major health crisis tied directly to asbestos exposure. In November of the year 2000, he published a series of articles in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer that exposed what had been hidden for so long. The headlines were blunt, the facts were horrifying, and finally the outside world was paying attention. The Environmental Protection Agency responded quickly. Within weeks, a team of EPA investigators arrived in Libby to begin testing soil, air, and even the insulation in homes. What they found confirmed Schneider's reporting: widespread contamination throughout the town. Even places that had no direct link to the mining site were testing positive for deadly asbestos fibers. This discovery led to one of the most aggressive environmental cleanup operations in U.S. history. The EPA declared Libby a public health emergency in the year 2009, the first time in its history that such a declaration was made for a single town. By then, thousands of residents had been exposed to dangerous levels of asbestos for decades. At the center of the crisis stood W.R. Grace & Company. As the owner of the mine, the company had long claimed it operated within the law, but internal documents now uncovered told a different story. Memos from as far back as the early 1970s mentioned concerns over dust levels, rising medical costs, and worker health problems. Some records even suggested efforts to downplay the risks or keep information from reaching the public. One of the most powerful voices to come forward during this time was a former mine manager named Robert Locke. He admitted under oath that he had been instructed to withhold certain safety information and had helped the company avoid drawing attention to the health hazards. His testimony became a key piece in the case that followed. In the year 2005, the United States Department of Justice indicted 7 current and former executives from W.R. Grace & Company. They were charged with conspiracy, fraud, and knowing endangerment. Prosecutors argued that the company had placed profits above lives, choosing silence over responsibility. The trial became a major national news story. People across the country were finally hearing the name Libby and understanding just how long its residents had suffered. Despite all the evidence and emotional testimony, the outcome of the trial surprised many. In the year 2009, all 7 individuals were acquitted of criminal charges. The jury found that the government had failed to prove that the men knowingly put lives at risk. While the legal case was over, the public outrage continued. For the people of Libby, the verdict felt like a second betrayal. But the exposure of the disaster had changed things. Federal aid began flowing into the town, medical screenings were expanded, cleanup crews were sent to remove contaminated insulation from homes, schools, and public buildings. And perhaps most importantly, the story of Libby forced a national conversation about the dangers of asbestos and the importance of environmental oversight. The damage, however, was already done. The physical toll couldn't be reversed, families had lost too much, and even as cleanup efforts began, residents had to live with the knowledge that their town would never be the same. After the criminal trial ended in the year 2009, the people of Libby were left to deal with the aftermath. While the verdict had disappointed many, the town's fight for justice wasn't over. Libby was now the focus of one of the largest and longest-running environmental cleanup efforts ever carried out by the United States government. Over the next decade, the Environmental Protection Agency worked to decontaminate schools, homes, parks, and businesses. Specialized crews removed tons of asbestos-contaminated soil, tore out old insulation, and replaced it with safer materials. It was a massive operation that took years, and it was only possible because the town had finally been heard. In addition to the physical cleanup, the federal government took a rare step. Congress passed legislation that gave Libby residents access to long-term health care. Under the Affordable Care Act, a special provision was added specifically for victims of the asbestos exposure in Libby. This made them eligible for federal benefits to help with medical costs, including treatment for asbestos-related diseases. It was a small but significant win for the community, proof that their voices had finally reached Washington. A local clinic, the Center for Asbestos-Related Disease, or CARD, became a lifeline for many families. Doctors there specialized in diagnosing and treating asbestos illnesses. They also helped gather data to better understand the long-term effects of the contamination. What they found was heartbreaking. People who had never worked in the mine, including children and spouses of miners, continued to show signs of illness. In some cases, the asbestos exposure came just from playing in a backyard or handling clothes covered in dust. These stories showed how far the contamination had spread and how deeply it had affected the town. Despite the progress, Libby faced another challenge: its identity. For years, the town had been defined by what happened there. News reports, documentaries, and books told the story of a place poisoned by asbestos. Tourism dropped, property values fell. Some residents moved away to escape the constant reminder of what had been lost, but others chose to stay and rebuild. They planted new gardens, restored old buildings, and created events to bring the community together again. Slowly, Libby began to shift from a story of tragedy to one of resilience. The local high school started teaching students about what had happened, not to dwell on the pain, but to ensure it was never forgotten. Public art projects were launched to honor the victims. One mural downtown shows a family standing strong together, surrounded by trees and mountains. It's a symbol of what Libby had endured and what it continues to overcome. Today, Libby is still recovering. Some places remain off limits due to lingering contamination, and for many, the health problems remain. But the town is no longer silent. It has become a case study for environmental justice, a reminder of what happens when profit is valued over safety and what it takes to fight back. The legacy of Libby lives on in court rulings, environmental policies, and medical research. It also lives on in the strength of its people. Their voices, once ignored, changed the law, forced government action, and brought national attention to an invisible killer. Libby's story is a hard one. It is full of loss, anger, and unanswered questions, but it is also a story of courage, of a small town that refused to be forgotten. On January 15th, 1919, in the north end of Boston, something unexpected was about to happen. A massive storage tank, standing 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, filled with molasses, sat just outside the busy neighborhood. It was owned by the Purity Distilling Company and held over 2.3 million gallons of molasses, roughly 13,000 tons of the thick, sweet liquid. This molasses was used to produce ethanol, which would be shipped out from nearby factories. However, the tank itself was flawed from the start. The construction was rushed and its design was poor, with some saying it was built with subpar materials. Right from the beginning, it leaked molasses, and locals often joked about the sticky smell in the air. But no one imagined that this small, ongoing issue would lead to a catastrophe. As winter wore on, the weather in Boston had warmed up, causing the molasses inside the tank to thin out, making it more volatile. With the tank filled to capacity, pressure began to build. The combination of overfilling and the expanding liquid caused the tank to become unstable. The molasses was no longer just a sweet, harmless substance. It was now a ticking time bomb, ready to explode, and that explosion would be unlike anything the city could prepare for. On the afternoon of January 15, 1919, Boston's North End became the scene of unimaginable chaos. At around 12:30 p.m., without warning, the massive molasses tank that had stood in the area for months suddenly gave way. The steel walls of the tank burst open with a deafening roar, sending a wall of thick, brown liquid surging out at a terrifying speed. The molasses moved with the force of a flash flood, racing through the streets at an estimated speed of 35 miles per hour. The wave of molasses, as much as 15 feet high in places, swept through the narrow streets, overwhelming everything in its path. The streets, once bustling with life, became a slippery, sticky mess. Buildings were battered by the sheer force of the wave, while cars and horses were quickly trapped in the thick molasses. The flood struck with such speed and power that many didn't have time to react. As the molasses continued to surge through the neighborhood, it trapped people and debris alike. Several homes, warehouses, and even train tracks were engulfed. People who were unfortunate enough to be caught in the path of the flood were swept off their feet, often unable to escape the overwhelming tide. The liquid, dense and heavy, trapped victims under its weight, making it difficult for anyone to get free. As chaos unfolded, cries for help echoed through the streets, but the molasses made rescue efforts incredibly difficult. Emergency responders and bystanders struggled to wade through the thick sludge, which was as sticky as it was dangerous. People who had been swept into the flood found themselves unable to move or breathe, unable to get free from the sticky grip of the molasses that held them fast. The scene was both terrifying and surreal, as the usually peaceful neighborhood was now in the grip of an unstoppable disaster. Once the molasses flood subsided, the full extent of the devastation began to unfold. The north end of Boston was left in ruins with wrecked buildings, overturned cars, and streets coated in a sticky, brown residue. The air was thick with the smell of molasses, which clung to everything it touched. The cleanup efforts would take weeks, but the impact of the disaster was far more than just physical. By the time the molasses flood had receded, a tragic toll had been taken. 21 people had lost their lives and over 70 others were injured. The victims came from all walks of life, from children playing in the streets to workers who had been near the tank when it collapsed. In the days that followed, the city was left to reckon with the loss of life, the destruction, and the trauma that would linger long after the molasses had been cleaned up. As the city began to recover from the chaos, the investigation into the cause of the disaster quickly became a matter of great urgency. The cause of the explosion was initially unclear, and authorities scrambled to understand how such a catastrophic event could have occurred. The molasses tank had been built by the Purity Distilling Company, a business that manufactured and stored molasses for use in alcohol production. Many speculated that the tank had been poorly constructed or improperly maintained, but it would take months for the full details to come to light. The first clue came when investigators found that the tank had been under immense pressure. The molasses inside the tank had fermented over time, which increased the pressure on the walls of the tank. This pressure likely contributed to the eventual rupture. However, the tank's design also came under scrutiny. It was revealed that the tank had been built with low-quality materials and had shown signs of weakness for months leading up to the disaster. The company had failed to take proper precautions to address these issues, even after the tank had exhibited signs of leaking. By the spring of 1919, the investigation led to a lawsuit filed against the Purity Distilling Company by the victims and their families. The case would eventually uncover not just a failure in engineering, but also a failure in oversight and accountability. The company's lack of concern for safety, as well as the poor construction of the tank, were deemed significant factors in the disaster. The legal battle would drag on for years, but the flood of molasses left an indelible mark on the city of Boston and its people, serving as a painful reminder of the deadly consequences of negligence. While the immediate aftermath of the molasses flood in Boston was filled with cleanup efforts and legal battles, the disaster left a long-lasting impact on the city and the surrounding community. The flood was not just a moment of chaos, but a turning point in how industrial safety and urban infrastructure would be approached moving forward. In the years that followed, Boston would make significant changes to both its building codes and its regulations regarding industrial facilities. The city's authorities, faced with public outrage and widespread fear, worked to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. The disaster brought into sharp focus the dangers of poorly constructed industrial structures in densely populated areas, especially those handling volatile materials. One of the major reforms that arose from the Molasses flood was the increased scrutiny of industrial tanks and storage facilities. Prior to the flood, there were very few regulations governing the construction and maintenance of large storage tanks, particularly those used for the storage of liquids. After the disaster, the city enacted stricter guidelines for tank construction, including more rigorous inspections and higher safety standards. This was one of the first major steps in a larger movement toward industrial regulation that would continue to evolve throughout the 20th century. The impact of the flood was not just felt in Boston's legal and regulatory systems, but also in its culture. The Molasses flood became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked industrial growth. The disaster was a stark reminder of how progress and development, if not carefully managed, could lead to devastating consequences. In many ways, the Molasses flood was a wake-up call for other cities across the United States and around the world, highlighting the need for better planning, oversight, and accountability in industrial ventures. Additionally, the memory of the Molasses flood lingered in the collective consciousness of Boston residents. Many still remembered the eerie, sickly sweet smell that lingered in the air for weeks after the event. The flood was also a focal point for discussions about urban safety, as it was clear that cities needed to prioritize the safety of their residents as they continued to grow and industrialize. The flood would be remembered not just for its immediate tragedy, but for its role in shaping the future of urban planning and industrial regulation. The Purity Distilling Company, responsible for the tank, would eventually be absorbed by the American Molasses Company, which faced ongoing scrutiny in the wake of the disaster. Although the company never fully recovered its reputation, the incident left an indelible mark on the history of industrial accidents in the United States. The tragedy of the Molasses flood would be remembered as one of the strangest and most devastating industrial disasters in American history, reminding future generations of the importance of safety and responsibility in industrial design. The Boston Molasses flood of 1917 may have been a forgotten disaster for many years, but its effects continue to echo throughout history. As one of the most unusual and deadly industrial accidents in American history, the tragedy captured the imagination of people everywhere. Over time, the memory of the disaster faded from public consciousness, but it left behind lasting lessons on the importance of safety in industrial design, urban planning, and regulatory oversight. In the years following the disaster, legal actions were taken against the companies involved, though many of the victims' families faced years of legal battles and little to no compensation. The outcome of these cases varied, but the publicity surrounding the flood helped shape the future of industrial regulation in the United States. The government, as well as businesses, recognized the need for increased safety measures and better oversight in the face of rapid industrial growth. The site of the disaster, which had once been a bustling industrial area, would later be redeveloped. Over time, it became home to various residential and commercial buildings. The Molasses flood's exact location is now near the site of what is today known as the North End of Boston. The tragic events of that day may be distant in the past, but they remain an integral part of the city's history, symbolizing both the dangers of industrial negligence and the strength of a community in the face of adversity. Although many people associate the flood with its shocking and grotesque details, molasses coating streets and buildings, the sickening smell, the loss of lives, its legacy is not solely defined by the immediate horror. The Molasses flood helped spark a broader movement towards stronger industrial safety laws, especially in the years following the flood. The public's outrage played a key role in demanding change and pushed forward the evolution of workplace safety, labor rights, and environmental protections. To this day, the Molasses flood is often cited as an example of what can go wrong when regulatory systems fail to anticipate the dangers of industrial operations. It is a reminder that no matter how commonplace or benign a product might seem, when handled recklessly, it can have disastrous consequences. Though the flood is long over, the lessons learned from it continue to guide policy, law, and industrial safety standards to this day. The Molasses flood, while an almost surreal and tragic event, stands as a reminder of how powerful and dangerous human innovation can be when safety is neglected. It serves as a testament to the resilience of the people of Boston who rebuilt their city and, in time, turned an era of disaster into one of progress, ensuring that future generations would learn from the past. The memory of the Molasses flood will always remain a crucial chapter in the history of Boston and a warning to others about the importance of safety in the face of rapid industrialization. On the night of April 26, 1986, the world changed forever. At the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine, an explosion ripped through Reactor 4, releasing massive amounts of radiation into the atmosphere. The disaster unfolded in a matter of seconds, but its consequences would last for generations. What was meant to be a routine safety test turned into one of the worst nuclear accidents in human history, a catastrophe so severe that its effects are still being felt today. The Chernobyl power plant was part of the Soviet Union's push for nuclear energy, a symbol of technological progress. Located near the city of Pripyat, the plant housed 4 operational reactors, with 2 more under construction at the time of the disaster. Reactor 4, the one that would explode, had been in operation for just 3 years. The plant used RBMK reactors, a Soviet design that had serious flaws that were ignored for the sake of rapid expansion. The accident occurred during a late-night test meant to determine whether the reactor could still be cooled if the plant lost power. To conduct the test, operators disabled several key safety systems, something that should never have been done under normal conditions. Due to a combination of human error, poor reactor design, and a lack of proper safety protocols, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. A sudden power surge led to 2 massive explosions, blowing off the reactor's heavy steel and concrete lid. Flames shot into the night sky, and within moments, a deadly cloud of radioactive material was released. The force of the explosion was so powerful that pieces of the reactor were hurled across the plant grounds. Firefighters, unaware of the radiation exposure, rushed to the scene to battle the flames. Many of them had no protective gear, and within minutes of arriving, they began experiencing severe symptoms of radiation poisoning, dizziness, vomiting, and intense burns. The graphite from the reactor core burned fiercely, and as the fire raged, radioactive particles were carried by the wind, spreading across Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, the Soviet government initially downplayed the severity of the explosion. Pripyat, a city built to house the plant's workers and their families, was not immediately evacuated. For over 36 hours, residents continued their daily lives, completely unaware that they were being exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Children played outside, families attended school and work, and life went on as if nothing had happened. It wasn't until radiation levels spiked in Sweden nearly 1,000 miles away that the world realized something was terribly wrong. By the time the Soviet government acknowledged the disaster, the damage had already been done. Pripyat was finally evacuated on April 27th, but by then thousands of people had already been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Buses lined the streets as residents were ordered to leave immediately, taking only what they could carry. Many never returned. The city, once a thriving community, became a ghost town overnight, abandoned in a desperate attempt to escape the invisible threat that lingered in the air. As the Soviet authorities scrambled to contain the disaster, the full scale of what had happened was only beginning to be understood. The explosion had not just devastated the reactor, it had created an ongoing crisis that would require massive resources and human sacrifice to control. The response in the days and weeks ahead would determine how much worse the situation would become, and for those who remained at the plant, the danger was far from over. In the chaotic hours following the explosion at Reactor 4, Soviet officials struggled to grasp the full extent of the disaster. The immediate priority was to extinguish the raging fires and prevent further explosions, but the situation was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. With radiation levels climbing to lethal amounts, every decision carried life or death consequences. The first responders, many of whom were local firefighters, had unknowingly walked into a death trap. They had been called to the scene, believing it was a routine industrial fire, unaware that they were stepping into one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Without protective gear, they fought the flames with water, completely exposed to the intense radiation streaming from the destroyed reactor core. Within hours, many of them began experiencing severe symptoms: nausea, dizziness, and painful burns. Caused by radiation penetrating their bodies, some collapsed on the spot. Despite their suffering, they continued working, trying desperately to contain the disaster. Meanwhile, inside the control room of Reactor 4, plant workers struggled to understand what had happened. Many refused to believe that the reactor had exploded. It was not just denial, it was the result of years of Soviet propaganda promoting the idea that their reactors were completely safe. Some operators were ordered to manually pump cooling water into what was left of the core, exposing themselves to deadly radiation in the process. Others tried to restore power to the plant, unaware that their efforts were futile. The damage had already been done. As news of the explosion spread among Soviet leadership, there was hesitation about how to respond. The government's instinct was to cover up the severity of the situation. Officials debated whether to alert the public or keep the disaster a secret, fearing international backlash and damage to the Soviet Union's reputation. While these discussions took place behind closed doors, people in Pripyat continued their daily routines, completely unaware that invisible radioactive particles were already settling over their city. Radiation levels in and around the plant were astronomical. Readings on dosimeters, devices used to measure radiation exposure, quickly maxed out. Some devices even failed entirely due to the extreme radiation. Despite this, government officials were reluctant to acknowledge the scale of the catastrophe. Scientists who raised concerns were ignored or silenced. And it wasn't until radiation alarms at a Swedish nuclear plant detected unusual activity that the Soviet government was forced to admit that something had gone terribly wrong. Finally, more than a day after the explosion, evacuation orders were given for Pripyat. Residents were told that they had only a few hours to gather their belongings. They were reassured that they would be able to return soon, but in reality, none of them would ever see their homes again. The evacuation was rushed, with long lines of buses stretching down the roads, carrying thousands of people away from the growing nuclear crisis. The eerie silence that followed would mark the beginning of Pripyat's transformation into an abandoned city, frozen in time. Even after the residents were removed, the danger remained. The destroyed reactor was still emitting dangerous amounts of radiation, threatening to spread even further. The Soviet government now faced the impossible task of stopping an ongoing nuclear disaster with limited knowledge, outdated equipment, and workers who had no idea what they were stepping into. The next phase of the response would require unprecedented human sacrifice, as thousands of people were sent into Chernobyl's radioactive ruins to prevent an even greater catastrophe. In the days following the explosion, Soviet authorities faced an overwhelming crisis. With Reactor 4 still spewing radioactive material into the air, the priority was to contain the spread before it reached catastrophic levels. However, with radiation levels so high that even machines failed, the task fell largely to human workers, thousands of whom would later be known as the liquidators. These liquidators were made up of soldiers, firefighters, plant workers, and volunteers, many of whom had little to no understanding of the dangers they were walking into. They were tasked with clearing debris, disposing of contaminated materials, and constructing makeshift barriers to slow the release of radiation. Some were even ordered to shovel highly radioactive graphite off the reactor roof, a task so dangerous that they were only allowed to work for seconds at a time before being replaced. Even with such short exposure, many suffered from acute radiation poisoning. One of the most urgent threats was the risk of a second explosion. Below the damaged reactor, a massive pool of molten nuclear fuel was burning through the concrete foundation. If it reached the large water reservoirs beneath the plant, the resulting steam explosion could have been powerful enough to contaminate much of Europe with lethal radiation. To prevent this, a group of 3 engineers and plant workers volunteered for a near-suicidal mission, diving into the flooded basement to drain the water manually. Their efforts succeeded, preventing what could have been an even greater catastrophe. At the same time, Soviet scientists and engineers worked to construct a massive concrete structure, known as the sarcophagus, to encase the reactor and limit further radiation release. It was a rushed effort, built under extreme conditions, and it would later require major reinforcement. But at the time, it was seen as the only viable solution to stop the crisis from spiraling further out of control. As the response continued, the Soviet government finally admitted to the world that an accident had occurred. However, the full scale of the disaster was still downplayed. Only after increased radiation was detected in other countries did more details start to emerge. International pressure grew, forcing the Soviet Union to take more drastic action. Scientists and nuclear experts from around the world offered assistance, but political tensions made collaboration difficult. Meanwhile, the effects of radiation exposure were beginning to take a toll. Hospitals became overwhelmed with liquidators and first responders suffering from radiation sickness. Many of these individuals had no idea they had been exposed until symptoms appeared: burns on their skin, organ failure, and in many cases, fatal complications. Despite the growing crisis, thousands more workers were sent to continue the cleanup, some with little more than cloth masks and basic protective suits. By this point, the abandoned city of Pripyat had become a haunting reminder of the disaster. Houses, schools, and amusement parks sat untouched, frozen in time. Personal belongings were left behind as residents had expected to return. Over time, nature began reclaiming the city, but the radiation levels remained dangerously high. The Chernobyl disaster was no longer just a Soviet problem. It had become an international concern. Scientists and world leaders debated how to prevent similar disasters in the future, but the full consequences of Chernobyl were still unfolding. The disaster's impact on human health, the environment, and even politics would continue to grow in the months and years ahead. As the months passed, the full scale of the Chernobyl disaster became clearer. The radiation released into the environment was not just a local problem. It spread across vast regions, carried by the wind and contaminating land, water, and food supplies far beyond the borders of Ukraine. Belarus, in particular, suffered heavily, with large portions of its farmland becoming unsafe due to radioactive fallout. Even areas in Western Europe detected elevated radiation levels, forcing some countries to take drastic measures, such as banning the sale of contaminated food products. One of the most alarming long-term consequences was the impact on human health. While many of the liquidators and first responders suffered immediate effects from radiation exposure, the true cost of the disaster would be measured over generations. Increased cases of thyroid cancer, particularly in children, became one of the most well-documented health effects. This was largely due to the release of radioactive iodine, which was absorbed by the thyroid gland through contaminated milk and other food sources. In response, medical studies were launched to track the long-term health effects of radiation exposure, with scientists trying to understand how deeply Chernobyl had altered human DNA. Birth defects, immune system disorders, and other illnesses were reported among populations exposed to high levels of radiation, but the full impact remains debated to this day. The Soviet government and later the Ukrainian government set up programs to provide compensation and healthcare to victims, but resources were often limited. Meanwhile, the long and complicated process of decontaminating the affected areas had begun. Entire villages were abandoned, with buildings demolished and soil removed in an attempt to reduce radiation levels. In some cases, entire forests were bulldozed and buried because the trees had absorbed dangerous amounts of radiation. The exclusion zone, covering thousands of square miles around the plant, became a permanent no-go area with only a few elderly residents choosing to return despite the risks. Wildlife in the exclusion zone also faced major consequences. Many animals showed signs of genetic mutations, while others, including birds and large mammals, struggled to survive in the altered environment. Over time, however, something unexpected happened. Nature began to reclaim the abandoned land. With no human interference, populations of wolves, bears, and other wildlife started to thrive, creating a strange paradox. An area once deemed too dangerous for humans became a haven for animals. Despite these changes, the damaged reactor remained a major concern. The hastily built sarcophagus that covered Reactor 4 was not designed to last forever, and over the years, cracks and structural weaknesses began to appear. If it collapsed, radioactive dust could once again be released into the air, causing another environmental crisis. To prevent this, an international effort was launched to build a new containment structure, one of the largest engineering projects ever undertaken. Known as the New Safe Confinement, this massive steel structure was designed to completely enclose Reactor 4 and prevent further radiation leaks. It was carefully constructed and then slid into place over the existing sarcophagus, a feat that required precise planning and execution. This new barrier was designed to last for at least a century, buying time for future generations to find a permanent solution to the dangers posed by the reactor's remains. Even with these efforts, Chernobyl remains an ongoing challenge. The disaster reshaped nuclear policy worldwide, leading to stricter safety regulations and renewed debates about the risks of nuclear power. Some countries moved away from nuclear energy entirely, while others doubled down on improving safety measures. The lessons of Chernobyl continue to influence discussions about energy, safety, and government transparency, ensuring that its legacy will not be forgotten. Decades after the Chernobyl disaster, Its impact is still being felt in ways both seen and unseen. While the exclusion zone remains largely uninhabited, scientists, researchers, and even tourists visit the area to study its long-term effects and witness the eerie remains of what was once a thriving community. Pripyat, the abandoned city near to the power plant, stands frozen in time, a haunting reminder of the sudden evacuation that took place all those years ago. Buildings crumble, nature overtakes the streets, and personal belongings remain scattered as if waiting for their owners to return. Despite ongoing concerns about radiation, Chernobyl has also become a site of great interest for scientists studying how ecosystems adapt to extreme conditions. Wildlife has flourished in the absence of human activity, with some species showing resilience to radiation exposure. While mutations and shortened lifespans have been observed in certain animals, others appear to be thriving, raising new questions about nature's ability to recover from nuclear disasters. At the same time, there is still no clear solution for dealing with the long-term storage of nuclear waste from the disaster. While the new safe confinement structure provides a temporary solution for Reactor 4, the question remains what will happen when it, too, reaches the end of its lifespan. The effort to decommission the plant and safely manage its radioactive materials will continue for generations, requiring constant attention and funding. The people most affected by Chernobyl, those who were evacuated, the liquidators who risked their lives, and the families who lost loved ones, continue to fight for recognition and support. Some survivors still struggle with health problems linked to radiation exposure, while others have spent years advocating for justice and better assistance. The disaster exposed the dangers of government secrecy and the consequences of ignoring safety concerns, lessons that many believe should never be forgotten. Chernobyl also serves as a warning for the future of nuclear energy. While advances in technology have made modern reactors safer, the disaster remains a symbol of what can go wrong when human error, flawed designs, and poor decision-making collide. The event changed the way the world viewed nuclear power, leading some nations to phase it out, while others work to improve safety standards. The debate over nuclear energy's risks and benefits continues, shaped in part by the haunting legacy of Chernobyl. Though decades have passed, the Chernobyl disaster remains a powerful reminder of how one moment in history can alter the course of the future. The lessons learned from this tragedy have influenced global policies, scientific research, and public awareness about the dangers of radiation and the need for transparency in times of crisis. While efforts to contain and manage the site continue, the story of Chernobyl will always stand as a cautionary tale, one that must never be ignored or forgotten.